Joaquin Castro.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member, for organizing this hearing today. And before I address my questions to our witnesses, I want to reiterate my support, most of all, for the Cuban people. I continue to be moved by their plight for their freedoms and their fight for their freedoms, for COVID-19 assistance, and an end to hunger in their nation. And I express my solidarity with them, especially with those brave Cubans who remain disappeared or have been imprisoned for standing up for their human rights and for their families. And I join UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, in her call to the Cuban government to immediately release those arrested during the protests. I also think it's necessary for the United States to, as President Obama said during his visit to Havana, bury the last remnant of the Cold War in the Americas and pursue a Cuba policy that improves the lives of the Cuban people. And so I wanted to ask a few questions of our witnesses, or actually before I do that, I know there's a debate about the embargo and how much that's responsible versus the Cuban government and so forth. And most of all, we support the freedom of the Cuban people and their right to choose the leadership of their nation. As Americans, we want to be as helpful to that as possible. But in this debate about communism and socialism and so forth, our biggest trading partner, the United States, is a communist country, China. We have no embargo against China. That's our biggest trading partner. So I have a question to Ms. Vivanco. Thank you for your testimony today. And a question that remains after the mass protests across Cuba is what the United States government can do to best improve the lives of the people of Cuba. In his historic speech and diplomatic trip to Havana, President Obama discussed at length how the United States embargo and policy of isolation towards Cuba was not working, saying, quote, "The embargo is outdated and should be lifted." So, Mr. Vivanco, what is the current purpose of the U.S. embargo in Cuba, and how does it help or hurt the Cuban people?
Congressman Castro, thank you very much for your question. In my view, following human rights conditions in Cuba for over 30 years, my conclusion is that it's time for the U.S. to take a different approach. It's the only country in the world that enforces a policy of isolation. That policy is rejected unanimously for the rest of the world. Even conservative governments from Europe and Latin America has never agreed with the policy of the embargo because it imposed indiscriminate sanctions against the people of Cuba and has shown to be absolutely ineffective. If you want to bring change to Cuba and transition from dictatorship to democracy, you need to create a multilateral approach, a new type of approach to create the right kind of incentives and pressure for the Cuban to take those steps. Cuba is not isolated from the rest of the world. Tourists from Europe, Canada, or any country in Latin America could spend their money, they could invest in extractive industries in Cuba. The only one that is isolated from Cuba is the U.S. The only one that is isolated in this debate at global level on the Cuban affairs is the U.S. Why? Because the policy of isolation made the position of the U.S. actually kind of impotent with regard to the debate on Cuba.
I also wanted to ask you about remittances, the ability for folks to send money to Cuba. You know, remittances are a vital lifeline to millions of Cubans, especially the most vulnerable, like the elderly, and are used to purchase basic necessities like sanitary items and food, and even obtaining access cards to have access to the internet. The Trump administration imposed restrictions on remittances and pushed the largest receiver of family remittances in Cuba, Western Union, to abandon operations on the island. Unfortunately, these harmful policies continue today. So I wanted to ask you, can you describe how remittances help the most vulnerable of Cubans to survive and obtain daily necessities?
It is absolutely essential to facilitate the use of remittances, the descent of the ability of Cuban families and friends to send money for their relatives to be able to survive in the country, to be able to buy the minutes, to use Wi-Fi and internet, which is available in Cuba, and is one of the vehicles that explain this mobilization in Cuba. I think is the right approach to reestablish the ability of Cuban families to send money to their relatives in Cuba.
Thank you. I yield back, Chairman.